So it's my pleasure to introduce the fourth and final speaker in this panel, Helena Esser. Helena is pursuing a PhD in English literature at Birkbeck College, London, and her research examines how steampunk fiction repurposes shared urban imaginaries of Victorian London. She has published on steampunk London, post-humanism, cyber cities, Gothic legacies in Ripper Street, and neo-Victorian popular fiction. And Helena's paper will be on Ankh-Morpork as cross-media urban imaginary. So, over to Helena.
Great. Yeah, I'm really happy to be here. Really looking forward to this. And let's jump right in to the big Wahoonie. Poets have tried to describe Ankh-Morpork, says Pratchett in Maud. They have failed. I am no poet, so let's hope that I'll be a little more successful. But it is indeed a daunting venture to try and fathom this fantastical epitome of cityness. In this paper, I'm going to outline quite loosely and a bit intuitively some of the ways in which I think Pratchett's Ankh-Morpork could be approached as an object of study. Maybe Pratchett just doesn't have faith in the poets of Discworld, because his own description is quite astute and evocative. He says, perhaps it's the sheer zestful vitality of the place, or maybe it's just that a city with 1 million inhabitants and no sewers is rather more robust for poets who prefer daffodils, and no wonder. Let's just say that Ankh-Morpork is as full of life as an old cheese on a hot day, as loud as a curse in a cathedral, as bright as an oil slick, as colorful as a bruise. Sorry, so sorry. And as full of activity, industry, bustle, and sheer exuberant buzziness as a dead dog on a termite mound. Here alone, Pratchett's eye-winking mention of daffodils conjures up British romantic William Wordsworth, and with it perhaps the sublime city composed upon Westminster Bridge, which he then, of course, proceeds to dismantle through vivid and somewhat Dickensian metaphors about old cheese and... Louis coming again, I'm so sorry. Which he then proceeds to dismantle through vivid, somewhat Dickensian metaphors about old cheeses and dead dogs. His is an image of a city defined by activity, chaos, and dirt, where grandeur and shabbiness coexist side by side, and one that is intrinsically connected to our own real world. I'm so sorry. So sorry about this. Let's take a step back. What is Ankh-Morpork and why is it important? So Ankh-Morpork doubles as Discworld's largest city and most powerful state. In a setting that started as a parody of epic fantasy literature tropes, a metropolis was perhaps an unusual addition. Indeed, while the city has traditionally been imagined through medieval-looking materials and aesthetics that often characterize fantasy literature at large, not least by long-term Discworld artist Paul Kidby. Ankh-Morpork is perhaps more grounded in an early modern European aesthetic, with a few special nods to Renaissance Florence. Lord Veterinary, after all, is a Machiavellian character, and there's a quite obvious cameo of Leonardo da Vinci in Leonard of Quern. In addition, Ankh-Morpork is a city-state with a history of war against others and continually evolving through various, although mostly technological impulses, which enact an industrial revolution that begins with the printing press in the real 15th century and ends with the railway in the real 19th century. Maps of Ankh-Morpork show themselves sensitive to this multi-layered, multi-temporal texture. They illustrate how Discworld and Ankh-Morpork in particular exemplify Henry Jenkins' concept of transmedia world-making, where, quote, artists create compelling environments that cannot be fully explored or exhausted within a single work or a single medium, unquote. As the city has been chronicled across multiple Discworld novel strands and illustrated through publications such as the Ankh-Morpork City Guide or the Ankh-Morpork Archives. The city guide notably contains a map of the great twin cities of Ankh-Morpork that you can see here, which conjures up early modern maps of London, like the Agas map. A bit small, but I hope you can see that the little houses are sort of three-dimensional as well. And it includes a panorama at the bottom that notes important spires, like the panorama of Wenceslas Holler, as you can see here, which chronicles the City of London's church spires before and after the Great Fire of London 1666. However, the panoramic view of the city also reminds us of maps like this. And these are balloonists' maps of the city as they became popular in the 19th century. And the perspective is quite similar, as you can see. So echoes of Victorian London abound across Ankh-Morpork. After all, it has its own Hyde Park and Park Lane, where we find Lady Sybil and Commander Vimes' villa. And whereas the park itself is, of course, older than the 19th century, it was during the 19th century that London's Park Lane advanced to the most fashionable address in the city. And similarly, I would posit that the shades share not a few characteristics with London's End, which acquired a mythic reputation as a derelict, lawless, and dangerous terra incognita, especially in the wake of the Jack the Ripper murders in 1888. Other downsides of the metropolitan life are humorously transfigured through the river Ankh, water so polluted that famously you can walk on it. And before Joseph Bazalgette's civil engineering project that provided the Thames with its embankment and a functioning sewer system, the tidal Thames was also so polluted that it was identified as a main source of frequent cholera outbreaks. And in 1856, the so-called Great Stink exacerbated the smell of untreated human waste throughout the summer. And it is indeed smell that Pratchett often associates with the big Wahoonie. And whereas we may now identify social topographies, crime, and environmental challenges as universal markers of large cities, it's no coincidence that Ankh-Morpork plays markers of Victorian London. Between the 1830s and 1918, London was the largest city in the world. While it lost that title to New York, whose sleek Art Deco-inspired skyscrapers enshrined the urban aesthetic of the 20th century, London was and remains the epitome of the metropolis of the Industrial Revolution. And Ankh-Morpork, after all, undergoes its own industrial revolution by acquiring newspapers and mass media, a version of telegraphy or photography, and the railway. All technologies that also transformed the 19th century. It's no coincidence either that the City Guide features elaborate advertisements modeled on Victorian magazines. And similarly, the guide introduces us to the guilds and its members in a way that is reminiscent of Henry Mayhew's urban ethnography in London Labour and the London Poor. Other illustrations may be linked to the bustle of Gustave Doré's etchings for London a Pilgrimage, which themselves may conjure up the bustle and sheer exuberant busyness as a dead dog on a termite mound, with which Pratchett describes Ankh-Morpork. So let us consider this passage again. The imagery of termite mounds, curses in cathedrals, old cheese, and the colorfulness of bruises creates an ambience of a practical, busy, shabby vivacity, which we might also link back to Mayhew's chronicle of various urban trades, or indeed the quaint but eccentric urban aesthetics of Charles Dickens. There's an entire paper to be written about Dickensian aesthetics and the mediation of Ankh-Morpork, or in Paul Kidby's work. My aim here is not to suggest that Ankh-Morpork is merely a fantasy version of Victorian London. Indeed, the Big Wahoonie, which is after all a play on the Big Apple, is more complex than that. Instead, I should suggest that the trappings and the aesthetics of the Victorian metropolis appear to be most suited to expressing many of those essentially urban features and processes that Ankh-Morpork interrogates as a city of cities. And through a neo-Victorian shorthand, that might be interesting to explore further. However, neo-Victorian aesthetics are just one aspect that helps configure Ankh-Morpork and its fundamental and universal cityness. In the course of his novels, and I would say perhaps between Masquerade and Feet of Clay, Pratchett begins to mobilize Ankh-Morpork more and more consciously to explore what a city is and means. And we see this here. It wasn't a city, it was a process, a weight on the world that distorted the land for hundreds of miles around. People who'd never see it in their whole life, nevertheless, spent that life working for it. Thousands and thousands of green acres were part of it, forests were part of it. It drew in and consumed, and gave back the dung from its pens and the soot from its chimneys and steel and saucepans and all the tools by which its food was made, and also clothes and fashions and ideas and interesting vices, songs and knowledge, and something which, if looked at by the right light, was called civilization. That was what civilization meant. It meant the city. And here the city is outlined as a gigantic socio-cultural, economic, and political mechanism that in turn is identified as representing civilization, in line with the long-running traditions of Western thought. Pratchett also traces the city's independent aliveness by evoking how Ankh-Morpork is palimpsestically built on itself. And most notably, Pratchett frequently also how urban space shapes identity and produces a specifically urban knowledge. I just love this quote. There was a typically Ankh-Morpork street scene outside, although people were trying to separate them. And while, of course, that's a typically humorous way of poking fun at the rowdiness of cities, it also implies that there are ways of behavior specific to the urban environment. In this, he takes up an echo of what sociologist Georg Simmel defined in 1903 as the urban habitus. The metropolis frees city dwellers from the social surveillance of the community and releases them into the independence of anonymity, an essential marker of this urban identity. Simmel was mostly inspired by London, Paris, and Berlin at the turn of the century, cities which also inspired quintessentially modern figures like the flaneur. Pioneered in Charles Baudelaire's 1863 Painter of Modern Life, as an idle observer of the city's fleeting crowd, he was conceptualized by Walter Benjamin in the 1930s as a metropolitan artist-poet, half voyeur, half detective. In Ankh-Morpork, we follow the very real detective Sam Vimes, who is certainly not an artist-poet, but a keen observer who knows the city intimately and takes possession of it by walking its streets. Indeed, he can tell where he is in the city by the feel of the cobbles through the soles of his shoes. It was good to feel the streets with dry feet again, and after a lifetime of walking them, he did feel the streets. There were cobblestones, catheads, trollheads, loaves, short and long sets, rounders, morkbox sixes, and the 87 types of paving brick, and the 14 types of stone slab, and the 12 types of stone never intended for street slabs, but which had got used anyway, and had their own patterns of wear, and the rubbles, and the gravels, and the repairs, and the 13 different types of cellar covers, and the 20 types of drainlets. He bounced a little, like a man testing the hardness of something. Elm Street, he said. He bounced again. Junction with Twinkle. Yeah, he was back. Vimes' intuitive and tactile relationship with the city puts into play Frederic Jameson's concept of cognitive mapping, which and in this concept, we read cities through mental maps. That because they represent, in Louis Althus's words, a subject's imaginary relationship with his or her real conditions of existence, also function as a situational representation of our relationship with the ensemble of society's structures as a whole. Vimes represents this dual physical and symbolic relationship also through his role as a policeman. His mental map of and personal relationship with the city exemplifies how urbanist Edward Soja configures the urban imaginary, namely as our mental and cognitive mapping of urban reality, and the interpretive grids through which we think about, experience, evaluate, and decide to act in these spaces, places, and communities in which we live. And lastly, his favorite pastime of walking the streets in itself also produces the city of Ankh-Morpork, in line with Doreen Massey's concept of space as more than the sphere of a discrete multiplicity of inert things, and rather as one that presents us with the heterogeneity of practices and processes. As she explains, this is the space as a sphere of dynamic simultaneity, constantly disconnected by new arrivals, constantly waiting to be determined, and therefore always undetermined by the constructions of new relations. It's always being made and always therefore in a sense unfinished. Considering space product of a multitude of histories whose resonances are still there, histories buried as well as still being made, she argues that to travel through space is to participate in its continuing production. To journey through the city like Vimes means joining up with and linking into the collection of interwoven stories of which that place is made. This is especially true for the copper, whose aim is the prevention of crimes, and who repeatedly stumbles into ongoing shenanigans. I want to end this talk by considering how Pratchett mobilizes this urban setting to illustrate social and cultural realities that characterize urban life in very familiar ways, albeit through a lens of defamiliarizing fantasy. In his exploration of gender identity and expression through the dwarf Cheery Littlebottom, who we might easily theorize through queer theory, he makes explicit how it is social freedom of the city that is the urban habitus, which inspires her to explore her gender performance outside of the traditional norm. And he writes, then Cheery Littlebottom had arrived in Ankh-Morpork and had seen that there were men out there who did not wear chainmail or leather underwear, but did wear interesting colors and exciting makeup. And these men were called women. And in the little bullet thought had arisen, why not me? And Angua as well acknowledges that Ankh-Morpork is a space where the traditional norms of outside the city lose their power. She, Angua corrected. This is Ankh-Morpork, you know, we've got extra pronouns here. Anyway, if people can't be themselves in Ankh-Morpork, where can they? And lastly, especially the fifth elephant in Thud ruminate the challenges of a multicultural urban society where different cultures coexist and potentially clash. And I don't have time to go into this very deeply, but I'm going to read some highlights. And especially language that Pratchett uses here will be familiar to everyone who's sort of lived in a multicultural setting, which is lots of us. In some of the alleys off Treacle Mine Road, you could believe you were in another country. There were plenty of dwarfs around now who had been born in Ankh-Morpork. Their kids went around with their helmets on back to front and spoke dwarfish only at home. Many of them wouldn't know a pickaxe if you hit them with it. Yeah. Sorry. That was then. Now there were too many dwarfs and trolls. No, mental correction, the city had been enriched by vibrant, growing communities of dwarfs and trolls. Now the melting pot lumps again. And one of my favorites, maybe I shouldn't have brought a troll, he thought. But where does that lead? Pick your own copper from a chart? And in conclusion, Ankh-Morpork is a richly textured, multifaceted and transmedial setting which enshrines the cityness of cities across historical, visual, social, mental and cultural trajectories. It mirrors the urban identities and realities we ourselves are familiar with and offers multiple avenues of inquiry to the emerging Pratchett scholar. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much, Helena. That was a really fantastic paper. We do have about 10-15 minutes for Q&A. So as always, please post your questions for Helena in the chat. Everyone was really is profusely thanking you for the paper. So thanks again. I guess I'll just start things off until the questions start coming in. What was it that inspired you to sort of focus on the urban imaginary of Ankh-Morpork as one facet of the Discworld in particular?
It's mostly my PhD actually. My PhD is on how steampunk fiction reimagines Victorian London. And so I've been looking a lot at sort of how how do we think of cities? What is a city? How does it shape who we are? How do we theorize them? How do we live in them? And how does that translate to a fantastic setting? In this case, steampunk. And once I was deep into that, I kept thinking about the Discworld, because it seems to use similar strategies and do different things, and it's such a it's such a good representation of all these different ways in which we actually think about cities, and it's probably not even on purpose, but it's so good.
Fantastic, thank you. All right, we have a two-parter in the comments. So the first part being, because change happens so quickly in Ankh-Morpork, do you think it is problematic to have a uniform medieval style depiction of the city in Discworld merchandise? By the end of the series, the city is medieval, early modern, Victorian, as well as magically mutable compared to our own world. And the second part being, second part of the question reads, the homeless characters in Ankh-Morpork see the city as their own private and ever-changing theatre. Do you think Pratchett is deliberately repurposing the flaneur character and giving marginalized characters of the city? So part one is have a uniform medieval style depiction in merchandise, and two is Pratchett applying the role of the flaneur to marginalized communities in the city?
Oh, that's really cool questions. So first off, yes, I think that the depiction of Ankh-Morpork in a medieval style has a lot to do with how cities or how fantasy settings are represented just traditionally across different media. When in reality it seems to move away from that. As I say, I kept thinking about this looks much more like Renaissance Florence or Victorian London. And we see this, I think, in the work of Paul Kidby and the sort of the additional publications from the Discworld Empire, where we see increasingly Victorian fashions. I think the Assassin's Guild especially is often portrayed with bustles and top hats and cravats and all these Victorian trappings. So I do wonder how adequate that medieval style is for what's actually going on. The other one, yes, I love the beggars. I think they're really interesting because they do remind me a lot of Henry Mayhew's urban ethnography. And Mayhew was in the 1840s, he went into the East End of London and to see how people were living there, because it was a space that people didn't often go to. And he wrote this elaborate sociological, anthropological chronicle of what people did and how they made their living and how they looked. And it was a bestseller, and people were really interested. And I think that the beggars are sort of a version of that. And because they've made the city their own in their own way and living happily outside of the norms, I guess. So they are really alternative, really fascinating band of people, absolutely.
Thank you. This next question sort of speaks to something I was thinking about too, as you were giving your paper. Do you think that the Discworld evolves into steampunk as Ankh-Morpork goes through its industrial revolution? And I guess is that a genre label that you might apply to the Discworld as a whole, to certain, sections of them?
Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah. I mean, steampunk has wide and flexible definitions. I usually think about it as a sort of neo-Victorian style that sort of piles on techno-fantasy and retro speculation. That sort of and lots of steampunk settings are also fantastical. And I think definitely when we get to snuff and raising steam and the moist books, we're entering into a more Victorian aesthetic. So we could definitely talk about where this steampunk comes in. Absolutely.
Great, thank you. So again, lots of questions coming in now. Let's see, where did I get up to? Um, sorry, bear with me. Do you think that Pratchett considers cities to be inherently expansive or reductive for people? For example, it allows Cheery to explore herself, but we see other characters lamenting that people are losing touch with their own culture.
Mm.
So how do you think the city figures as sort of a site of living for the citizens of Discworld?
I think it's probably both.
Mm,
Because that's how we see cities in the real world as well. There are opportunities, there's freedom, not just socially but economically and politically. But there are also downsides, like the ecological cost and the fact that some people get left behind, like the beggars, for example. So I think the Pratchett does a good job of exploring both those directions or both those ends of the spectrum. Um, through these characters, and that there are some opportunities, but there are also downsides, and it's so fascinating to see how he represents sort of the dwarf community in the city, because they have different faith and a different culture, and it's really difficult to understand them, and that rings so many bells with sort of real life multicultural spaces. And yeah, I think it's both.
mhm. Thank you. So I'm going to yoke together another two questions that have appeared in the chat, both of which relate to the watch. So the first part is between Vimes's relationship to the city and the idea that if you can make it in the watch, you can make it as a species, quote unquote. Why do you think the watch specifically is framed as being so important in the identity creation of the city, and also as the melting pot of cultures, and also the melting pot of cultures and peoples who inhabit it? So that's the first part. And second part being, what do you think of the Watch TV adaptation, which is sort of leaning heavily into a more steampunk version of Ankh-Morpork?
Mm. I find it really interesting and really fascinating that Pratchett chooses the Watch as his focal characters, especially because when he started writing Men at Arms, I think that was not at all his intentions. I think he said something about he just wanted to write a book about the characters that usually run over in these kinds of stories, and then they expanded and they became so central to his work. I think what we heard in the last paper about the city and polis or the polis, in that the city sort of represents the civilization and the totality of a society, and that the watchmen are positioned sort of as mediators and negotiators of how that life in that melting pot is lived, and how what's right, what's wrong, and who watches the watchman, who keeps the peace. There are essential questions also about sort of society as a whole, and I think that's why the watch is so well positioned, sort of geographically and socially and symbolically. And what do I think of the Watch series? I have very mixed feelings. It does look very steampunky, and I think if it wasn't sort of inspired by Discworld, it could have been a cool series, or it could be if it wasn't claiming to be Discworld, I guess, sort of on its own, because they changed so many things for no reason that I can see, that it doesn't look very promising, to be honest. Not as an adaptation of the Discworld.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of people would agree with you there. All right, let's see. A question pertaining to the sense of smell. So someone asked, for the smell, isn't it the most important characteristic of the city reception? And if you agree, what do you think the reason for this is?
I find it interesting that Ankh-Morpork still doesn't have sewers. So it has a railway, but it doesn't have sewers. Which is, I think, a fun sort of relic of this medieval aesthetic. And yeah, maybe in a book that Pratchett hasn't written yet, Moist sort of is put in charge of the sewer system. Although we do have Harry King, so I don't know if he would take on Harry King. I think, yeah, cities do have smells. I think Paris is quite famous for having a certain smell. So this, and I think 19th century London, especially with sort of a tidal river that brings in all the debris all the time. Also, just a real sort of byproduct of living in large cities. I think that he just loves to exaggerate and make fun of.
All right, whizzing through. Next question is: I've always loved the Granny Weatherwax quote, or the idea that progress just means bad things happen faster. Does this link in any way to your research on steampunk, Helena, in terms of how the movement repurposes the past and the future? So, echoing the utopian, dystopian trends toward trends away from that have been discussed sort of in the previous papers.
Yeah. I think Granny is really, she's really distrustful of lots of forms of culture, like theater and pretending to do things, and progress, I think, because she's really distrusting of people as a whole. But yeah, in my impression, I think sort of steampunk definitely is fascinated with the idea of progress, especially in the Industrial Revolution, because it constantly keeps going back and then inventing fantastical things that never happened, like airships and steam-powered computers. So, but I think it's definitely grappling with sort of the potential and the downsides of it in both ways. Sort of, wouldn't it be cool if, but also what could be the downsides of that? Yeah.
Great. Let's see. Oh, so what do you think is the biggest catalyst for Discworld's Industrial Revolution?
That's really interesting. So when I reread the Ankh-Morpork based novels recently, I was really struck by how much of the culture that comes in the Moist books and the Railway, and how so much of that is dependent on there being a public forum, a public culture, and that is very, very much based on the newspapers. So just the fact that there is, that there's a forum, that there's a place where people say their thing, and where people sort of negotiate the reality they live in, which I guess is a parallel to the real world, just much more compressed. So I would probably say the printing press.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, we've got a few minutes left. We can go until 12:50, so I'm going to grab the last couple of questions from the comments. Someone asks, isn't Ankh-Morpork the place where there is no normal? The unusual, the outside are the norm, and binary, traditional, usual, commonplace just doesn't exist. Would you say that's a fair characterization of the city?
Yeah, that's a really good one. I think so. I think just Pratchett takes the real life and the real city and finds all the things that are weird and absurd and interesting and fun about it, and then exaggerates them. Absolutely, yeah.
Great. And interesting question here. Do you think the collective view of Ankh-Morpork is influenced more by the many Ankh-Morpork paratexts? This is a question from Marita, so feel free to expound in the comments, Marita.
Yeah, I think it has really grown through the addition of sort of visual things and maps, and just also the visualization of characters just that Paul Kidby did. I think before that people really struggled to visualize it. I think if you look for like Pinterest boards or just mind maps or things of how people would draw fan art of Ankh-Morpork, then it's sort of very often this generic fantasy medieval style. And the paratexts have made that much more complex and much more easily imaginable.
Yeah. Great, thank you. And final question, I guess, and unless somebody jumps in at the last minute, I think I speak on behalf of everyone when I ask, what is the name of your cat, please?
So my cat's name is Garfield. I also call
Okay.
him Tiger. Yeah, because he
Oh,
doesn't really look like a Garfield. Yeah. So he's
there we
usually
go.
called Tiger. Yeah.
Okay. Garfield slash Tiger, we stand. All right. I think we're just about at time. So I want to say thank you to Helena and indeed to all our presenters, David, Matthew, and Ruchira as well. Thank you to the fantastic audience for your questions and engagement. Thank you to James and Christoph and everyone at Trinity. And I hope I did a satisfactory job at fielding questions. If I didn't, please send your complaints to the Unseen University. They will be read with care. And get some more coffee, go refresh yourselves for the next presenter at 1 p.m., which is in about 10 minutes. So thank you again, everyone, and have a great day.